Hi, Mark. Thanks very much for having me on the show. So, I am a food futurist. And the first question I get when I tell people that is, what's a food futurist? And I
Yeah.
hate to tell the audience, I am not a fortune teller. I cannot tell them the winning lottery numbers. I can't tell them who's going to win the next Super Bowl. I'm sorry about that, to disappoint people. Because if I could do something like that, I would be on my mega yacht on the French Riviera in Saint-Tropez. But of course, well, really, I'd much rather be here anyway at TEDx Santa Barbara, of course. But so that's what I can't do. But what I can do is look at things in food and ag and look at what we call alternative futures, way in which the future could eventuate. And I like to look at the ways in which I think the future should eventuate.
I like that you made that distinction for us. And when we talk about the future, I think it's good to sometimes look in our rearview mirror and look at the past and kind of learn some lessons from the past. I think the challenge that we have right now is with an exploding population and climate change and kind of all of these forces all at the same time. There are unique challenges around growing food and proteins and the choice of foods. And do we go to a world of Soylent Green where we just take a pill? Pick any one of those threads to start with, sir.
Well, look, I think you're right. I think the thing is, there's a saying I love, which is, if hindsight is a wonderful thing, foresight is even better.
Mm.
And foresight is what we need. We've seen that we haven't had a lot of foresight in terms of climate change, certainly not in a general population sense and political sense. That is now starting, I think, to come home. And as you said, we are faced with this inevitable fact that we are going to have nearly 10 billion people on the planet by 2050. And the other inescapable fact we have is that if we look at what we can produce healthily, equitably, and keyly sustainably using our current global agricultural system, is that much protein. But we need that much
Mm.
protein, that much
Mm.
food by 2050. So how do we fill that gap? I mean, we could just deforest the entire planet and grow more food, but I'd suggest that's probably not going to end well. So what do we do? How do we maximize our resources? How do we healthily and equitably feed the planet? But key, it's got to be done sustainably.
Yeah, that because that for all the obvious reasons. We had Dr. Stephen Gaines on earlier in the show, talking in this series, talking about the amount of land it takes to grow the protein to fill that gap. And I think he said it was something like the size of Africa. Like we're going to need that much land. And he is a proponent of aquaculture, and he said the similar amount of protein to meet those needs could be done in the 5 miles off the coast of New Zealand, just the upper island. So if you just aqua farmed. So
Yep.
I'm curious, is it going to be that kind of just a complete mind shift?
The thing is, if we look at it, let's look at it from the point of view, we had a lot of people saying, want to destroy animal agriculture by 2035 and all these sorts of things. I think there are two things to realize here. One is, if we stop raising animals for food tomorrow, about 2 months, no chickens. There goes most of our meat protein. 6 to 9 months, no pigs. 2 years, no beef. Now, how do we fill that gap? There's just the change is going to be a transition. And I think we're going to need all sources of protein for decades to come, whatever views may be on animal cruelty and industrial farming.
Sure.
I mean, the reality is, to replace 10% of the global meat supply in 2030 requires an expenditure, according to the Good Food Institute, 1.8 trillion US dollars of capital investment. Now, I'm a techno optimist. I believe technology can do virtually anything. Proper application of technology can solve any problem. So let's say they get it down to only $1 trillion. I like round numbers. So that's 125 billion US dollars of capital expenditure every year between now and 2030. I would suggest that's not going to happen. So
I have a quick question, Tony.
cultivated meat. Yep.
What are they spending the money on? So that's lab meat?
Yeah, this is sorry, I should say, yeah, this is cultivated meat, cultured
Got it.
meat. So basically, to replace 10% of the global supply of meat with cultivated meat would require that amount of money. Now, that's simply not going to happen. It's not going to happen this year, that's for sure. It's not going to happen next year. So we're looking at some point $300 or $400 billion in 1 year worth of capital expenditure in terms, you're right, Mark, factories, but land, factories, equipment, and to fully commercialize any new technology, you need some degree of capital expenditure. For cultivated meat, it's quite high because it's quite a high technology.
Right.
And then you go back down to some of the other ones require less. But that's simply not going to happen. If we reach, in my view, a couple of percent of cultivated meat in global terms by 2030, I think we'll be doing very, very well.
So let's go back to the original question that you propose. Is how do we feed 10 billion people by 2050? So a 2% solution here, a 1% solution here, that doesn't feel like it scratches the itch.
Yeah, look, I think you're right. I think what we need is a combination of technologies and a combination of strategies. So I think putting our eggs in any one basket, I mean, I hear quite often, but we grow enough food to feed the planet now. And in theory, that's correct. And I say, yeah, look, there's the world as we would like to see it, and there's the world as it is. And the world as it is can't use that amount of food to feed the planet for so many reasons. Food waste is a big one, reducing food waste, maximizing the amount of food we get from the food we grow is essential. I think the one that I heard from the World Resources Institute at one stage is, paraphrase them, all we have to do is stop people who eat too much eating as much and send it to the people who need it. And my reply to that is, we've been telling people in industrialized countries like Australia, US, and Europe, don't eat so much or you will die of lifestyle-related diseases. Now we're going to say, now, instead of that, could you please just eat less so we can send it elsewhere? I don't think that's going to work. So I think that what we need, Mark, is to look at these new technologies that are coming into food. I've never seen anything like it in over 30 years in the food industry, and apply those as one of our strategies for growing enough food to sustainably, healthily, and equitably feed the population of the planet.
So is it a technology that optimizes growing food, or is it some kind of new food replacement that you see the future in?
I think there's several tacks in there. One is, yes, increasing crop yields. So we have all sorts of things like AI being used for accelerated breeding. That would be good to get the growth traits and protein and so on. Then we have
Excuse me, Tony. How do you square the GMO controversy inside of that? Because now we have AI GMO, and that's got to raise some eyebrows, probably.
This is non-GMO. So what you do is, with a rise in genetics, you can do the genetic sequencing of various cultivars of a crop. And AI says, take this cultivar with that cultivar and cross that, then cross that one with that one, and it accelerates the breeding process. Now, you can use gene editing and GMO.
But you're saying you don't need to.
You don't need to.
I
think that using GMO, I don't have issues with that, but that's probably for another day. Yeah, so you can accelerate the plant breeding process. And we've got a company called Benson Hill. They have very high protein soy. I think it's about 50% more protein than the usual soy. And they've done that specifically so that they can use that soy crop to grow products that can be used for alternative proteins. Because let's face it, soy was never designed to be grown to make protein. It's oil.
Right.
Now, if you grow it for the protein instead, and the oil's the byproduct or a secondary product, that's a whole different ball game as well. And then you have a company called Pivot Bio. They have a soil microbiome. Now they can reduce the nitrogen usage by about 40 pounds per acre, about 45 kilos per hectare. And that's about 20% for crops like corn and wheat. And that gives the same yields. They've planted over 3 million acres so far, and their products working really, really well. So we don't end up with the runoff and the dead zones that we see like in the Gulf of Mexico every year, which is just horrendous.
So So look at you when you talked about how many million acres. I'm thinking about the land that we have available, and two things come to mind. One is we're an ocean planet, and we talked earlier about what they've done in New Zealand. We had a couple of young men who were post-grads out of a university in England who have figured out how to modify rice to be able to have the rice exist under saltwater conditions. And now they're growing these mile-wide patties in the ocean. That's perfect. Have you seen? But in addition to that, it feels like we could, grow things in the ocean that rather than just harvesting kelp, which I know we can do. We've done those kinds of things, but other crops. What's the future of that?
I think you're right, Mark. That is again another avenue that we should be exploring, because as you say, basically we're an ocean planet. We shouldn't be called Earth, we should be called water. Planet water.
That's funny.
But that still requires whole new technologies and ways of growing food. We're talking crops in agriculture versus aquaculture of fish and animals.
Correct.
That's a whole different ball game. And as we know, I mean, we have enough problems with our climate on land. On sea, I think that's something else that needs to be taken into account, is just how stable and how reliable it's going to be where we can grow aquaculture crops, if you like.
Well, I'm thinking when Epcot Center at Disney opened, someone would have to fact check me on this, but was probably 40 years ago, they had the first working hydroponic gardens at scale that we could see. I don't know that we've really done that at scale. And now I met up with a man this spring who does vertical farming, and he's having a really hard time making the economics work. Yet when you talk to them, and we had vertical cricket farming on the show early on. So it feels like we have space vertically that we could be playing with. So here's the question, Tony. It feels like there are these spot solutions where people are doing things. What's it going to take for there to be a seismic shift in our capability?
One of the things that that's going on at the moment is, of course, a lot of the technologies we're looking at are being applied in already industrialized countries, global, with established food systems. My view is we need to look at where the next big demand for food is going to be, which is throughout Southeast Asia, and particularly in coming decades in Africa. Let's face it, our current food system has done a really good job of feeding a lot of the planet. The 60s Green Revolution saved billions from starvation, but as we know, it hasn't been without its problems. Massive nitrogen and phosphorus inputs, runoff, greenhouse gas emissions, everything else. So my view is that what we need to look at is, rather than taking the current view of what we do is we grow food over here and we send it all the way over here. And I think under COVID and the Ukraine war, it's shown us that that is not necessarily a good idea. And I think that if we look at some of these new technologies that can be used that don't require arable land and produce large amounts of protein, and say to countries that are developing their food systems, hey, yes, you can copy us if you want to, but don't forget, we've got a lot of problems we need to clean up. Here's some alternatives, and look at how we advise or make available to countries with growing populations that there are other ways of doing it than the way that we do it now. There's a company called Solar Foods. They take their patented machinery, they suck in the air, they separate out the moisture, carbon dioxide and nitrogen. They turn the nitrogen into ammonia, and then they split the water into hydrogen and oxygen using solar energy, so Solar Foods. They combine them with some microbes and minerals, and they grow what's called biomass. Now, people might say, what is biomass? I don't know how many people who are listening know the infamous Australian Vegemite, that black paste that Australians love to put on their bread and toast. That is biomass. That's yeast that has been turned into a paste. You can turn yeast and other microbes into a protein source similar to things like soy protein concentrates and soy protein isolates. So you can grow food with no arable land, virtually no fresh water. And they say that if you had an area the size of Utah, you could feed the protein for the entire world if you put that under solar panels with their process.
So, so that gives me some hope. And we were talking before we went on air about AI and the impact of AI, and I know you're working in lockstep on that. But what got me thinking was, okay, so I'm thinking Soylent Green. I'm thinking this green biomass, but needs a way better name than that. But will there be a time? And then I'm thinking of deep fakes, right? So we can deep fake a person. Can we deep fake food? So we already know we're doing that with hamburger and meatballs, and they're starting to do that. So we it looks like something we're familiar with, but probably 3 generations from now, that's only 60 years, 3 generations from now, will that kind of food source be the norm? Do you have a prognostication for us?
I think that by 2030 and beyond, we're going to see products in the food system, on supermarket shelves, restaurants, cafes, food service, that we've never seen before. I think there are a whole range of ingredients out there that are going to be used to make these products. And I think some of those ingredients and products are just an idea in some startup founder's mind today. So I think that, say, I'm a techno-optimist. I believe there's no problem on the planet that can't be solved through the proper application of technology, which is what we've done as a human species to survive this far. We've kept applying technologies to problems as they come up, and that's how we've survived to date.
Tony, thank you so much for helping us. This problem is like hard to get done in a few minutes, but thank you so much for having this conversation.
No, that's no problems, Mark. And as you say, I think there are different ways of thinking about the global food system. And I think if we don't just think about it with tunnel vision of just cloning more of what we do now, and we apply human ingenuity and technology to the problem, we can solve the issue of feeding 10 billion people by 2050.